December 25th, 1941. A quiet man in civilian clothes arrives at the smoldering wreckage of Pearl Harbor. He is Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the new commander-in-chief of a shattered Pacific fleet. President Roosevelt has personally chosen him, leapfrogging 28 more senior admirals for the job. Nimitz wasn't a famed warrior or a political insider. His primary qualification was something else entirely. On December 7th, he was 2,000 miles away, a man with no fingerprints on the greatest defeat in U.S. Navy history. This is not the story of how an admiral won the war. It's the story of why he was chosen. To understand that choice, we have to look past the smoke and fire of Pearl Harbor and into the quiet, panicked offices of Washington, D.C. In the days following December 7th, the United States wasn't just facing a war, it was facing an institutional heart attack. The public, Congress, and the military itself were reeling from a single, terrifying question. How could this have happened? The search for an answer quickly became a hunt for a culprit. An entire system had failed, but a system cannot be put on trial. A man can. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, the commander at Pearl Harbor, became the focal point for a nation's fury and shame. He was swiftly relieved of command, his career and reputation shattered. The machine of war requires accountability. But in moments of crisis, the line between accountability and scapegoating blurs into non-existence. This created a profound and dangerous problem for President Roosevelt. The Pacific Fleet didn't just need a new admiral. It needed a complete psychological reset. The next commander couldn't be someone from Kimmel's inner circle, who might be seen as tainted by the same failure. But he also couldn't be one of Kimmel's rivals, who might use the command to settle old scores and purge the staff, destroying what little institutional knowledge remained. The Navy was turning on itself. Officers were writing letters, whispering in corridors, positioning themselves for the coming storm of investigations and recriminations. The entire command structure was at risk of descending into a civil war of blame and paranoia. This was the true, unseen crisis. The Japanese had sunk the American battleships, but it was the Americans themselves who were in danger of sinking their own navy's morale and cohesion. Roosevelt needed a leader whose first victory wouldn't be over the Japanese, but over the very culture of panic and retribution paralyzing his own forces. This isn't a story about finding the best warrior. It's a story about finding a specific tool for a specific, unprecedented political and psychological disaster. The central question of the Pacific War in December 1941 wasn't, how do we fight Japan? It was a far more difficult and immediate question. How does a commander take charge of a shattered fleet when his first mission is not to plan an attack, but to stop the institution from destroying itself from within? Before Chester Nimitz could face the Imperial Japanese Navy, he first had to survive the political battlefield of Washington and its desperate search for a villain. The search for a villain began on a Pan Am clipper flying east from Honolulu. On board was Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox. It was December 15th, 1941, just 1 week after the attack. Below him, the vast, empty Pacific. In his briefcase, a report destined for the president's desk that would act as the first formal indictment. Knox, a Republican newspaper publisher serving in Roosevelt's Democratic administration, had been sent to Pearl Harbor to be the president's eyes and ears. He saw the sunken battleships, the oil-choked water, the shocked faces of the survivors. But he also saw something else. A political time bomb. The American public was demanding answers, and Congress was sharpening its knives for an investigation. The Navy, as an institution, was on trial. Knox's report, delivered to Roosevelt on December 16th, was a masterclass in political damage control. It praised the courage of the men on the ground, but its core conclusion was damning. It pointed to a lack of readiness, a failure of imagination, and an inadequate state of preparedness for the attack. The report didn't name a single culprit. It didn't have to. There was only one man whose job it was to ensure that preparedness. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Kimmel was the very model of a pre-war admiral, a brilliant ordnance expert, meticulous, demanding, and fiercely dedicated. He had reached the absolute pinnacle of his profession, a 4-star command over the most powerful fleet on Earth. He was a battleship man, whose entire career had been built around the doctrine of decisive fleet action, of gray steel leviathans meeting on the high seas. On December 6th, he was one of the most respected officers in the United States Navy. By December 17th, his career was over. On that day, Secretary Knox issued a terse press release. Admiral Kimmel, along with Army Lieutenant General Walter Short, was being relieved of his command. The phrase was precise, clinical, and brutal. It wasn't a firing, it was a professional execution. The two men were not accused of treason or cowardice. They were simply being set aside. Their 4-star ranks, the very symbols of their authority, revoked. They were to be replaced, pending the outcome of a formal investigation. This was the first critical act in a political drama that would consume the Navy. The message was unmistakable. Failure at this level would not be tolerated, and accountability would be swift and public. For the politicians in Washington, it was a necessary act to appease public fury and demonstrate control. For the officers of the Pacific Fleet, it was a terrifying spectacle. Their commander, a man they knew and respected, was being publicly dismantled. His reputation, built over a 40-year career, was being sacrificed to protect the institution he had sworn to serve. The instrument of this sacrifice was the Roberts Commission, established by Roosevelt on December 18th. Headed by Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts, its purpose was to investigate the facts and lay the groundwork for blame. While not a court-martial, it had the full weight of a presidential inquiry. Its proceedings were held in secret, but its impact was felt everywhere. Officers were called to testify. Their every decision, every memo, every conversation from the months leading up to the attack scrutinized. A culture of caution instantly hardened into a culture of fear. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. It created what one historian called a paralysis of the will. Every admiral and captain in the Pacific now understood the new rules of the game. The greatest danger was not the Japanese Navy. It was a career-ending telegram from Washington. Taking a risk and failing was no longer just a tactical loss. It was professional suicide. The safest course of action was to do nothing that could possibly be criticized in hindsight. This paralysis had a name, Wake Island. As Kimmel's career was being dissected in Washington, 2,300 miles to the west, a small garrison of 500 U.S. Marines was fighting for its life. The defenders of Wake Atoll were holding off a vastly superior Japanese invasion force. A small, defiant flicker of hope in a sea of defeat. A relief expedition was scrambled. Task Force 14, built around the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga and led by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, was ordered to fight its way to the island. But the task force was slow. Plagued by refueling delays and cautious maneuvering, it crept towards Wake, the clock ticking. The man in overall command of the relief effort was Vice Admiral William S. Pye. Pye had temporarily inherited command of the Pacific Fleet after Kimmel was relieved. He was an admiral in an impossible position. He was the acting commander of a shattered fleet, with his predecessor's ghost looking over his shoulder. Pye knew that the Roberts Commission was in session. He knew that every decision he made would be judged. He was terrified of losing the Saratoga, one of only 3 carriers the U.S. had left in the Pacific. Losing another capital ship so soon after Pearl Harbor would be an unthinkable disaster. Not just for the war, but for his own career. He saw the ghost of Kimmel. On December 22nd, with Fletcher's relief force still a day away, Pye convened a meeting aboard his flagship. The news was grim. A second, more powerful Japanese invasion force, including 2 of their own aircraft carriers, was closing in on Wake. The risk of sending the Saratoga into that trap was immense. Pye and his staff debated. The operational calculus was grim. The political calculus was paralyzing. A daring, aggressive commander might have pushed through, but daring and aggression had been unofficially outlawed on December 17th. The final decision was made. Pye issued the order. Task Force 14 was to turn back. The relief of Wake Island was aborted. The message was sent to the garrison on Wake. No help is possible. On December 23rd, after 15 days of heroic resistance, the island fell. The men who had fought so bravely were now prisoners of war. They had been sacrificed not on the altar of military necessity, but of political paranoia. The system, in an effort to protect itself from blame, had failed to protect its own men. This was the Navy that awaited a new commander. It wasn't just a fleet with fewer battleships. It was an organization that was now fundamentally broken, Trust had evaporated. Initiative was punished. The command structure was a snake pit of whispering, backstabbing, and memo writing, as officers scrambled to document every order to ensure they wouldn't be the next Kimmel. The primary mission of many senior officers was no longer fighting the Japanese, but surviving the next congressional hearing. The hunt for a scapegoat had crippled the very institution it was meant to reform. The first enemy wasn't in Tokyo, it was in the mirror. Into this snake pit of blame and fear walked Chester Nimitz, a man once court-martialed for running a destroyer aground. And his first decisions would defy all political logic. On Christmas Day 1941, Admiral Chester Nimitz stepped off a seaplane into the humid Hawaiian air. He wore a plain civilian suit, his presence deliberately low-key. He was not here as a conqueror or a savior. He was here as a damage control officer for an entire institution. His temporary predecessor, Admiral Pai, the man who had recalled the Wake Island Relief Force, met him at the dock. The customary first stop for any visiting dignitary was the Overlook, the high ground offering a panoramic, heartbreaking view of Battleship Row. It was the epicenter of the disaster, the graveyard of the Old Navy, where the sunken hulls of the Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia rested in the oily water. It was the symbol of America's defeat. Pai gestured towards the view. Nimitz barely glanced at it. He had seen the photographs. He had read the reports. Staring at ruins was a waste of time. He turned to Pai and asked to see the submarine base, and then the repair facilities, and then the fuel depots. The request was baffling. It defied the entire emotional gravity of the moment. Pai and his staff were fixated on the loss, on the 7 sunken or beached battleships that represented the end of their world. Nimitz was looking past them, at the things that hadn't been hit. He walked through the machine shops, tapping gauges and speaking quietly with foremen. He stood by the massive dry docks, noting which were operational. He made his way to the tank farms, 189 massive steel cylinders, holding over 4.5 million barrels of ship fuel. The Japanese pilots, in their focus on the battleships, had ignored them completely. Had they been destroyed, the entire Pacific Fleet, including its precious few carriers, would have been forced to retreat to California. The war in the Pacific would have been lost for years. Nimitz saw what the Japanese had missed, and what the demoralized American command had failed to appreciate. The heart of the fleet wasn't the battleships, it was the infrastructure, the docks, the fuel, the repair yards, the logistical teeth of naval power, and they were almost entirely intact. Pearl Harbor wasn't a knockout blow, it was a bloody nose. The fleet was wounded, but its capacity to fight, to refuel, and to repair was still there. This was his first silent assessment. He was not inheriting a tomb. He was inheriting a functioning, forward-operating base. On December 31st, the official change of command ceremony took place. Naval tradition called for a grand affair on the quarterdeck of the fleet's flagship. But the flagship, the USS Pennsylvania, was in dry dock, its bow mangled by a Japanese bomb. To hold the ceremony there would be a spectacle of defeat. Instead, Nimitz made another quiet, deliberate choice. He ordered the ceremony held on the deck of a submarine, the USS Grayling. The symbolism was seismic. He stood on the narrow, cramped deck of a vessel designed for stealth, ambush, and attrition. He was signaling, without saying a word, that the doctrine of the decisive battleship engagement was dead. The old war was over. A new, uglier, and more pragmatic war had begun. A war fought from beneath the waves and from the air. He was turning the page. But his most dangerous decision was yet to come. It would take place not on the deck of a ship, but in the quiet of an office. After the ceremony, he met with the senior staff he had inherited from Admiral Kimmel. This was the moment everyone in the Navy was waiting for, the purge. These were the officers who were on watch when the attack happened. They were the men closest to the epicenter of the failure. In the paranoid atmosphere of Washington, they were seen as contaminated, their careers finished. The chief among them was Commander Edwin T. Layton, the fleet's intelligence officer. For months, Layton had painstakingly tracked Japanese naval movements. He had felt, with sickening certainty, that an attack was coming somewhere, but he had failed to pinpoint Pearl Harbor and, crucially, failed to convince Kimmel to sound a full-scale alarm. Leighton entered Nimitz's office and did what was expected. He formally offered his resignation, fully anticipating it would be accepted. He, like Kimmel, was ready to become a casualty of the system. Nimitz looked at him. He knew that firing Leighton and the rest of Kimmel's team was the politically safe move. It would show Washington he was making a clean break. It would satisfy the desire for new blood. Bringing in his own team was standard practice for any new commander. But Nimitz hadn't been chosen to be a standard commander. He refused Leighton's resignation. He refused all of their resignations. The attack on Pearl Harbor happened, Nimitz told his new intelligence chief. But as far as I'm concerned, that's all in the past. He then explained his reasoning, a logic that ran completely counter to the panic gripping the Navy. He told Leighton that he had spent his journey to Hawaii reading all the intelligence dispatches from the past year. He concluded that Leighton and his team knew more about the Japanese Navy than any other group of officers in the world. To throw away that accumulated knowledge in the name of political appearances would be an act of strategic insanity. It was an astonishing act of trust. At the very moment the Navy was tearing itself apart in a hunt for scapegoats, Nimitz was declaring the hunt over. He was drawing a line. The mission was no longer to assign blame for December 7th. The mission was to win the war. He needed competence, not clean hands. He chose to keep the men who had just presided over the greatest intelligence failure in American history, betting that their experience, seared by that very failure, was now his single most valuable asset. This decision sent a shockwave through the fleet. It was a signal that loyalty would be rewarded, that honest mistakes were survivable, and that the only thing that now mattered was performance. He was inoculating the Pacific Fleet against the political virus that had paralyzed it. He was giving his officers permission to think again, to take risks again, to lead again. He had won his first, most important battle without firing a single shot. By keeping Kimmel's intelligence team, Nimitz wasn't just saving their careers, he was unknowingly betting the future of the Pacific War on a man working in a windowless basement known as the dungeon. That decision, to trust the men who failed, led Nimitz down a flight of stairs, into the basement of the administration building at Pearl Harbor. It was a place few admirals ever saw, a windowless, soundproofed, perpetually lit concrete vault. This was Station HYPO, the fleet's radio intelligence unit. It was known to its inhabitants as the Dungeon. And in the center of this dungeon was its king, Commander Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort was not a typical naval officer. He was a brilliant, eccentric, and often insubordinate linguist and cryptanalyst who had spent years in Japan and spoke the language fluently. He worked in a smoking jacket over his uniform, his feet in worn-out slippers, his desk a chaotic mess of papers and overflowing ashtrays. His team was a hand-picked collection of misfits, mathematicians, crossword puzzle fanatics, and musicians from the ship's band of the sunken California, chosen for their exceptional pattern recognition skills. They worked brutal, mind-numbing hours under intense pressure, fueled by coffee and obsession. They were the Navy's outcasts, and they were Nimitz's last, best hope. While Washington's intelligence apparatus, OP-20G, was formal and bureaucratic, Rochefort's dungeon was an intellectual laboratory. Nimitz went there, sat down, and listened. He didn't issue orders, he asked questions. Rochefort and his team explained how they were painstakingly reconstructing the Japanese Navy's operational code, known as JN-25. It was a super-encrypted code, changed regularly, and considered by the Japanese to be unbreakable. But Hypo was starting to find the cracks. They were reading fragments, guessing at meanings, and slowly building a dictionary of the enemy's intentions. Nimitz saw past the bathrobe and the chaos. He saw a mind at work that was as valuable as any aircraft carrier. In a Navy that prized conformity, Rochefort was a radical, and in a command culture paralyzed by fear, Nimitz's decision to simply listen to this man was a radical act of leadership. He left the dungeon, having placed his faith not in a system, but in a person. He would need that faith, because 4,000 miles away, the architect of Japan's victories was planning his masterpiece. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was the most feared naval strategist on the planet. In less than 6 months, his forces had swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia in a stunning blitzkrieg. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, all had fallen. The British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse were at the bottom of the sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy seemed invincible. But Yamamoto was not celebrating. He was a gambler who understood that his early wins were bought with surprise and audacity. He knew America's industrial might would eventually turn the tide. His strategy was never to conquer the United States. It was to inflict such a series of shocking, painful defeats that the American public would lose the will to fight and sue for peace. Pearl Harbor was only the first step. The final piece of his puzzle was the American carrier fleet. The carriers had been absent on December 7th, a fact that haunted Yamamoto. They remained a dagger pointed at the heart of his new empire, proven by the Doolittle raid in April 1942, when American bombers launched from the USS Hornet struck Tokyo itself. The raid did little physical damage, but it was a profound psychological blow. The emperor's sacred homeland was not inviolable. For Yamamoto, the raid was a personal humiliation. It hardened his resolve. He had to destroy those carriers, now. He devised a complex, multi-stage plan to lure them into a trap. The bait would be the tiny, strategically vital American outpost at Midway Atoll. By attacking Midway, Yamamoto knew he would force the U.S. Pacific Fleet to respond. His own force would be overwhelming, a massive armada of over 150 ships, including 8 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, and scores of cruisers and destroyers, all converging on Midway from different directions. The American carriers would sail into an ambush from which there could be no escape. The decisive battle, the Kantai Kessen, would be fought, and it would be won. The plan was approved. The date was set for the first week of June. The entire operation rested on 2 absolute certainties. First, that the element of surprise was secure, because the JN-25 code was impenetrable. And second, that the American fleet was still so battered, demoralized, and cautiously led that it would react exactly as he predicted. On both counts, he was fatally wrong. Back in the dungeon, the trickle of information became a flood. In early May, Rochefort's team began intercepting a massive volume of coded Japanese naval traffic. The sheer number of messages indicated a major operation was imminent, far larger than the recent action in the Coral Sea. They were picking up call signs for carriers, battleships, and troop transports, all being marshaled for a single, massive thrust. Key phrases began to emerge from the cryptographic noise. They identified the date of the operation. They identified the forces involved. But one crucial piece was missing: the target. The decrypted messages referred to the objective only by the code designator AF. To the intelligence officers in Washington, AF could be anywhere: the Aleutian Islands, Fiji, even the west coast of the United States. But Rochefort, piecing together fragments and contextual clues, was convinced it meant one thing: Midway. It was a gut feeling, an educated guess based on his deep understanding of Japanese strategic thinking. But Nimitz couldn't risk his entire fleet on a guess. He needed proof. Rochefort devised a brilliant, simple, and incredibly risky plan. He proposed using the Japanese to confirm their own target. He asked Nimitz to order the base at Midway, using a secure undersea cable that the Japanese couldn't tap, to broadcast an unciphered, plain-language radio message. The message was to be a lie, a piece of false information designed to be intercepted. The message? We are running low on fresh water. It was a gamble. If the Japanese didn't take the bait, the ruse would be wasted. Worse, it could alert them that their codes were being read. Nimitz approved it. On May 22nd, the fake message went out from Midway. The team in the dungeon held their breath and listened. 2 days later, they got it. A Japanese intelligence outpost sent a message to the main fleet, dutifully encrypted in JN-25. Rochefort's team intercepted it and with trembling hands went to work. The decrypted text was short, and it was the single most important piece of intelligence in the Pacific War. It read, AF is short of water. The trap was real, and the target was Midway. Joe Rochefort, in his bathrobe and slippers, had just handed Chester Nimitz the enemy's playbook. The knowledge was a weapon, but it was also a death sentence. Nimitz now knew the time and place of the attack. He also knew he was catastrophically outnumbered. Yamamoto was coming with at least 4, possibly 5, of his best fleet carriers. Nimitz had only 2 operational carriers in the entire Pacific, the Enterprise and the Hornet, which were at that moment racing back to Pearl Harbor after the Doolittle raid. His third, the USS Saratoga, was still undergoing repairs on the west coast. His fourth, the USS Lexington, lay at the bottom of the Coral Sea. And then there was the Yorktown. On May 27th, she limped into Pearl Harbor, a ghost of a ship. She had taken a direct bomb hit in the Battle of the Coral Sea. A 250-kilogram bomb had pierced 4 decks before exploding, starting massive fires and killing or wounding 66 crewmen. Her flight deck was shattered, her internal structure a mangled wreck. She trailed a 10-mile oil slick. Nimitz met the ship at the entrance to Dry Dock Number 1. He walked her decks, accompanied by shipyard engineers. He saw the twisted steel, the burn marks, the gaping hole. He listened to the damage reports. The initial assessment from the Navy Yard was grim, but professional. To properly repair the ship, to cut out the damaged sections, replace the structural supports, and make her fully battle-worthy again would take at least 90 days. Nimitz looked at the chief engineer. He was calm, his voice betraying no hint of the impossible pressure he was under. "We must have this ship back in 3 days." The engineers were stunned. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, an order that defied the laws of physics and naval engineering. What followed was one of the greatest feats of battlefield repair in history. Over 1,400 workers swarmed the Yorktown. They didn't sleep, they didn't stop. They weren't repairing the ship for a long war. They were patching it for a single battle. Instead of replacing buckled support frames, they cut them out and welded in new ones right on top. They laid a steel plate over the hole in the flight deck. They didn't have time to test the ship's fuel tanks for leaks. They simply filled them with inert carbon dioxide gas to prevent explosions. It was a frantic, desperate, ugly job. It was a race against the clock, measured not in days, but in hours. As the welders' torches burned day and night on the Yorktown, Nimitz was hit with another crisis. The one man he needed most to lead this desperate fight was out of action. Admiral William Bull Halsey, the commander of Task Force 16, the pugnacious, aggressive, and most experienced carrier admiral in the Navy, was in a hospital bed. A crippling case of stress-induced dermatitis covered his entire body, leaving him in agonizing pain, unable to wear a uniform or command a fleet. Halsey was a living legend, the face of American naval defiance. Losing him on the eve of the most critical battle was a shattering blow to morale. Nimitz went to visit him in the hospital. Halsey, knowing he couldn't go, made a recommendation for his replacement, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. The choice was shocking. Spruance was Halsey's escort commander. He was a black shoe admiral, a commander of cruisers. He was brilliant, cool, and highly respected as a tactician. But he had never, not for a single day, commanded an aircraft carrier task force. The brown shoe aviators who flew the planes and ruled the flight decks viewed surface ship admirals with suspicion. They had their own culture, their own language, their own way of fighting. Spruance was an outsider. To put him in command of the Enterprise and Hornet, the core of America's entire remaining naval power in the Pacific, was an unbelievable gamble. Nimitz listened to Halsey. He met with Spruance, and he made his decision. He looked past the resume and saw the mind. He needed a commander who would be steady, who would analyze the intelligence from Roosevelt, weigh the risks, and not be tempted by reckless aggression. He needed a thinker, not a brawler. He gave the command to Spruance. The pieces were now in place. A barely repaired carrier crewed by exhausted men. A task force, commanded by an admiral with no carrier experience. And a battle plan based entirely on the work of an eccentric codebreaker in a basement. A man whose conclusions were about to be furiously challenged by his own superiors. Nimitz had staked everything on Rochefort's intelligence, but he was about to discover that his biggest fight wasn't with the Japanese Navy, but with his own superiors in Washington. The playbook for the Battle of Midway, delivered by Joe Rochefort, was the most valuable secret in the world. But a secret is only as powerful as the people who believe it. And in Washington, D.C., the men in charge did not believe. Nimitz's faith in Station HYPO was not shared by its bitter rival, the Navy's main cryptographic unit in the capital, known as OP-20G. This was the official heart of American naval intelligence, a powerful, bureaucratic organization that saw Rochefort's team in Hawaii as provincial upstarts. While HYPO was a chaotic den of intuition and improvisation, OP-20-G was the establishment, and the establishment had come to a very different conclusion. The analysts in Washington looked at the same fragments of intelligence and saw a different picture. They saw the AF is short of water message not as confirmation, but as a clever Japanese deception. They argued that Rochefort, emotionally invested and too close to the Pearl Harbor attack, was falling into a trap. Their own analysis pointed north, far to the north, to the desolate, fog-shrouded Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. Another Japanese force was indeed preparing to strike there, at Dutch Harbor. To the cautious, conservative minds in Washington, this was the logical main effort. The attack on Midway, they argued, was a diversion, a feint designed to draw Nimitz's carriers out of position while the real blow fell on American soil in Alaska. Some even feared a follow-up raid on the West Coast itself. This wasn't just a professional disagreement. It was a direct challenge to Nimitz's authority. The leaders of OP-20G took their case directly to the most powerful and feared man in the U.S. Navy, Admiral Ernest J. King, the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet and Chief of Naval Operations. King was a brilliant, abrasive, and notoriously unforgiving commander. His nickname was Old Indestructible, and it was said he shaved with a blowtorch. He trusted systems, not mavericks. He received daily intelligence summaries from OP-20G, briefs that methodically dismantled Rochefort's Midway theory and emphasized the threat to the Aleutians. The message from Washington to Pearl Harbor became increasingly sharp. You are misreading the intelligence. You are exposing the homeland to attack. You are about to send our last carriers into an ambush. Chester Nimitz was now utterly alone. He was 5,000 miles from his commander, Admiral King, and he was being told by the Navy's own Central Intelligence Bureau that his entire strategy was based on a delusion. Every instinct of a career officer screamed at him to obey the consensus, to hedge his bets, to split his forces and send a task force north to defend Alaska, as Washington implicitly demanded. To do otherwise was not just a tactical risk. It was an act of breathtaking insubordination. If he was wrong, his career wouldn't just be over. He would go down in history as the man who lost the Pacific War. The ghost of Admiral Kimmel, broken by a failure of intelligence, loomed over every decision. Here, in this crucible of doubt, was the true test of the man Roosevelt had chosen. A different admiral, one more concerned with his own survival, would have compromised. He would have written a memo for the record, citing Washington's concerns. He would have split the fleet. It was the politically safe, career-preserving move. It would have guaranteed defeat. Nimitz did none of it. He had sat in the dungeon. He had looked Joe Rochefort in the eye. He had listened to the intense, obsessive logic of the codebreakers. He had bet on them when he kept Kimmel's staff. He had bet on his engineers when he demanded the Yorktown in 3 days. He had bet on character over experience when he chose Spruance. All these decisions were links in a single chain of trust, forged not in Washington's political fire, but in the quiet confidence he placed in the people on the ground. To break that chain now was to admit that his entire style of command was a mistake. He picked up a telephone and called Edwin Layton, his intelligence chief, the man he had refused to fire. He asked him one last time. "Layton," he said, "are you and Rochefort certain?" Layton didn't hesitate. He was certain. That was all Nimitz needed. He made the loneliest decision of his life. He would disregard the explicit warnings from Washington. He would ignore the Aleutians. He would believe the man in the bathrobe. He issued the orders. Admiral Fletcher, with the hastily patched Yorktown, and Admiral Spruance, with the Enterprise and Hornet, were to sail not north, but toward a tiny, predetermined patch of empty ocean northeast of Midway, a location designated on their charts with chilling optimism. Point Luck. He was committing every single operational aircraft carrier he had to this one spot, on this one wager. There was no backup plan, no reserve. The quiet manager, the man chosen because he had no fingerprints on the last disaster, was now putting his prints all over the single greatest gamble of the war. Everything. The fleet, the future of the Pacific, his own reputation, was now sailing out over the horizon. The fate of the Pacific now rested on a single wager, a point on a map marked Luck. But for Chester Nimitz's gamble to even have a chance, he needed one more miracle. And on May 27th, 1942, that miracle looked like a ghost. The USS Yorktown limped into the channel at Pearl Harbor, a specter of a warship. She was not a proud vessel returning to port. She was a casualty, being carried from the field. Her victorious fight in the Coral Sea had cost her dearly. A Japanese bomb had plunged through her flight deck, exploding deep within her hull, and the fires had raged for hours. Now, her flight deck was a jagged mess of torn steel. She listed to port, trailing a 10-mile-long slick of black oil, a bleeding wound that stained the blue Pacific. To the thousands of men watching from the shore, she was a grim symbol. Even in victory, the price was nearly total. Nimitz was there to meet her. He didn't wait for a formal report. As the crippled carrier was carefully maneuvered into dry dock number 1, the largest on the base, he was already walking her decks. He stepped around twisted metal and over charred planks, the acrid smell of burnt paint and wiring still hanging in the air. He was accompanied by the yard's senior engineers, men who had spent their lives building and repairing ships. They pointed out the buckled support beams, the shattered internal compartments, the sheer scale of the structural trauma. Their initial assessment was delivered with the sober professionalism of experts. The damage was severe. To repair it correctly, to cut out the compromised steel, fabricate new structural members, rewire the electrical systems, and ensure the ship was once again fully seaworthy would take, at minimum, 90 days. 3 months. Nimitz listened patiently. He looked at the gaping hole in the flight deck, then at the faces of the engineers. He was under an impossible, invisible pressure. He knew that Yamamoto's fleet was already steaming towards Midway. He knew Spruance's 2 carriers were not enough. He knew that the fate of the war might be decided in the next 10 days, not the next 90. His response was quiet, devoid of anger or desperation. It was a simple statement of fact. A declaration of a new reality. We must have this ship back in 3 days. The engineers were silent. The words hung in the air, defying every rule of their profession. It was impossible. It wasn't a matter of effort. It was a matter of physics, of metallurgy, of time. A ship of this size and complexity could not be resurrected in 72 hours. It was a fantasy. But they looked at the admiral. This was the same man who had refused to fire them, who had kept the old staff, who had staked his command on trusting the people on the ground. This wasn't the tyrannical demand of an ignorant superior. It was a plea from a commander who was sharing the full, crushing weight of the crisis with them. He wasn't ordering them to do the impossible. He was asking them to join him in it. And in that moment, something shifted. The culture of blame and fear that had paralyzed the fleet was replaced by a culture of shared, desperate purpose. The answer wasn't, "Yes, sir." It was action. Within the hour, the dockside became the epicenter of the Pacific War. Over 1,400 men descended upon the Yorktown. They were not just the Navy's repair crews. They were civilian yard workers, welders, shipfitters, electricians, carpenters, men who had just finished their shifts and returned to work, men who were pulled off other jobs, men who simply grabbed a tool and asked where they were needed. The lights of the dry dock burned through the night, turning the Pearl Harbor sky into a permanent artificial dawn. The air filled with the constant, deafening roar of pneumatic hammers, the shriek of cutting torches, and the staccato flash of arc welders that lit up the ship's wounded hull like lightning. This was not a repair. It was a resurrection. It was frantic, brutal, and brilliantly pragmatic. There was no time for perfection. There was no time for by the book. The rule book was thrown overboard. The goal was not to make the Yorktown whole again. It was to make her fight again. Instead of meticulously cutting out and replacing the 3 massive bent steel support frames beneath the flight deck, the workers simply cut them loose with torches, shoved them aside, and welded new ones directly onto the existing structure. They didn't have time to manufacture a complex, curved replacement section for the flight deck. Instead, they took a massive steel plate from the yard, laid it over the hole like a patch, and welded it down. Below decks, carpenters from the base worked side by side with the ship's own crew, building new wooden planking for the flight deck over the damaged sections. They knew it wouldn't stand up to a bomb, but it would be strong enough to land and launch aircraft for one battle. That was all that mattered. The ship's own damage control parties, exhausted from their ordeal at Coral Sea, worked without rest. They didn't have time to properly test and certify the integrity of the ship's aviation fuel lines and tanks. A single leak could turn the entire vessel into a floating bomb. So they improvised. They purged the entire system and filled the voids around the tanks with inert carbon dioxide gas, displacing the oxygen to ensure that even if a leak occurred, the fuel vapor could not ignite. For 72 hours, the Yorktown was not a warship. It was a living, breathing organism of human will, a symphony of organized chaos. Men worked until they dropped, grabbing a few hours of sleep on the concrete floor of the dock before getting up to work again, fueled by endless pots of coffee and the knowledge that the entire fleet was waiting on them. On the morning of May 30th, it was done. The impossible had been achieved. The noise stopped. Slowly, the dry dock began to fill with water. The Yorktown rose, groaning. She wasn't the same ship that had fought at Coral Sea. She was a patchwork of desperate fixes. She still listed slightly. A faint sheen of oil still trailed from her patched-up hull, but she was alive. As she was nudged out of the dock by tugboats, a cheer went up from the shore. Thousands of workers, sailors, and officers who had watched the frantic, round-the-clock effort now saw the result of their labor. It was more than a repaired carrier. It was a physical manifestation of their own renewed spirit. 6 months earlier, the Navy had been a broken institution, paralyzed by failure and fear. Now, it had healed its own. Admiral Nimitz watched from an upper floor of the administration building. He saw the Yorktown, under her own power, steam past the sunken hull of the Arizona. She passed the ghosts of December 7th, and headed for the open sea. Her flight deck already busy with pilots and planes, her crew ready for battle. The ship wasn't perfect, but it was ready. And as it sailed to its rendezvous with destiny at Point Luck, it carried with it the resurrected soul of the United States Navy. The Battle of Midway is remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War, a clash of steel and fire that changed history in 5 minutes. But the most decisive battle was already over before the first plane took off from the Yorktown's patched-up deck. It was a battle fought not with torpedoes, but with phone calls, personnel files, and quiet acts of trust. It was a battle for the soul of the United States Navy, and Chester Nimitz had won it. President Roosevelt had not chosen a warrior. He had chosen an administrator. He had not chosen the most aggressive admiral. He had chosen the one least entangled in the poisonous politics of blame that followed Pearl Harbor. Nimitz was selected for his distance, for his clean hands, and it was precisely this distance that became his most powerful weapon. A commander from Kimmel's inner circle would have been paralyzed by the need to defend his deposed friend and the old regime. A rival would have been tempted to purge the staff, erasing institutional memory in a quest for dominance. Nimitz, the outsider, was free from both temptations. He did not arrive in Pearl Harbor to find culprits. He arrived to find assets. He looked at the smoking ruins and asked not, "Who is to blame for this?" but, "What is still working?" His gaze fell on the submarine pens, the fuel tanks, and the repair docks. And then it fell on the men. His decision to retain Edwin Layton, Joseph Rochefort, and the rest of Admiral Kimmel's intelligence staff was not just an act of forgiveness. It was an act of supreme strategic logic. Nimitz understood that the men who had just presided over the greatest intelligence failure in American history were now, paradoxically, the most valuable intelligence asset in the world. Their failure had not broken them, it had educated them in the most brutal way imaginable. They knew the enemy better than anyone because they had paid the price for underestimating him. To fire them in the name of political appearances would be to discard the very lesson their sacrifice had purchased. While Washington was busy writing memos, convening commissions, and hunting for scapegoats, Nimitz was building a coalition of the competent. He was drawing a line between the past and the future. The institutional instinct was to self-destruct, to cannibalize its own in a frenzy of recrimination. Nimitz stood against that instinct. He absorbed the panic from his superiors and refused to pass it down the chain of command. He became a firewall, protecting his people from the political radiation emanating from the capital. This single act of trust, believing Rochefort when his own bosses told him not to, was the foundation for everything that followed. It was why he had the confidence to commit his entire fleet to Point Luck. It was why he could look at the mangled wreck of the Yorktown and see not a liability, but an opportunity. The 1,400 workers who swarmed that ship for 72 hours were not just repairing a carrier. They were responding to a new kind of leadership, one that had replaced the fear of failure with the urgency of a shared purpose. The choice of Raymond Spruance, the quiet cruiser admiral, to lead the carriers was the final expression of this philosophy. Nimitz didn't need a brawler seeking vengeance for Pearl Harbor. He needed a cool, analytical mind to execute a plan based on Rochefort's delicate intelligence. He chose character over credentials, temperament over resume. He was building a team to win a specific battle, not to satisfy a committee. Admiral Yamamoto planned his Midway operation with the assumption that he was facing a broken, demoralized, and cautiously led enemy. He was right about the state of the U.S. Navy on December 8, 1941. He was fatally wrong about its state on June 4, 1942. He had accounted for every American ship and plane. He had not accounted for Chester Nimitz. He had not accounted for an admiral whose first victory was not over the Japanese fleet, but over the internal chaos of his own command. Nimitz's genius was not in the tactics of the battle itself. He was 2,000 miles away in his office at Pearl Harbor when the bombs fell on the Japanese carriers. His genius was in creating the conditions for that victory. He inherited an organization consumed by its past, and he turned its eyes to the future. He took a fleet that was terrified of making a mistake, and gave it permission to think, to risk, and to win. The quiet man in the civilian suit had not come to Pearl Harbor to command a battle. He had come to stop a civil war. By winning it, he made the victory at Midway possible. In the end, the choice was never about finding a warrior to win a battle. It was about finding a leader to save an institution.